He was 20 years old, sitting in the back of a twin-engine Beechcraft, clutching a trumpet case with both hands. The plane was shaking, not the normal kind of shaking you feel during a rough flight. This was different. This was wrong. Ben Cauley looked to his left and saw Phelan Jones, the saxophonist, staring out the window with wide eyes. Phelan turned and said 2 words. "Oh no." Those were the last words Ben Cauley ever heard his best friend say. And what happened in the next 90 seconds killed 7 people, destroyed the future of soul music, and left one 20-year-old trumpet player floating in freezing water, screaming the names of friends who would never answer. This is the story that Ben Cauley carried for 48 years. The story he told through tears every single time someone asked. The story of the day he survived while everyone around him died. And the story of why surviving was the hardest thing he ever had to do. To understand what happened on December 10th, 1967, you have to go back to where it all started. Not in the freezing waters of a Wisconsin lake, but in the dusty back roads of Georgia, where a boy named Otis Redding Jr. was born into a world that had almost nothing to offer him. Dawson, Georgia, 1941. The Redding family lived on a sharecropping plantation. Otis's father picked cotton and preached part-time at the Vineville Baptist Church. His mother cleaned houses just to keep the family fed. There were 6 children, and Otis was the 4th. He learned to sing before he learned to read, standing on a wooden crate in the church choir, belting out gospel hymns with a voice that was far too big for his small body. When Otis was 15, his father got sick with tuberculosis. The disease left him bedridden, unable to work, unable to preach. Otis dropped out of school. He dug wells. He hauled bricks. He worked as a roofer in the Georgia heat. But every night, no matter how tired he was, Otis sang. He sang on the porch. He sang walking to work. He sang like breathing was not enough, like he needed music to stay alive. There was a local talent show at the Douglas Theater in Macon. $5 to the winner. Otis entered and sang a Little Richard song. He won. He came back the next week and won again. 15 consecutive weeks until the organizers told him he could not compete anymore because it was not fair to the other contestants. That was $75, enough to keep the lights on for a month, enough to make his mother cry with relief. His big break came on an October afternoon in 1962 inside a converted movie theater on East Macklemore Avenue in Memphis. The building did not look like much from the outside. A plain brick facade with a sign that said Stax Records. But inside, something revolutionary was happening. Black and white musicians were playing together, creating a new sound that blended gospel, rhythm and blues, and raw emotion into something the world had never heard before. They called it soul. Otis had driven guitarist Johnny Jenkins to a recording session. Jenkins did not have a license, so Otis was the driver. The session was not going well. There were about 40 minutes of studio time left when Stax co-owner Jim Stewart looked at Otis sitting in the corner and said, "You want to try something?" Otis walked to the microphone and sang a ballad he had written called These Arms of Mine. His voice cracked on the first note, not from nervousness, but from something deeper, something raw and wounded and desperately human. Steve Cropper, the white guitarist who would become Otis's most important collaborator, put down his coffee and stared through the glass. When Otis finished, the studio was silent. These Arms of Mine became a hit, and the driver became the singer. Over the next 4 years, Otis released a string of songs that redefined popular music. Pain in My Heart, Mr. Pitiful, I've Been Loving You Too Long, Respect, the song Aretha Franklin would later make her own, and Try a Little Tenderness, a performance so explosive that audiences literally could not stay in their seats. Otis did not just sing. He attacked the microphone. He screamed. He begged. He dropped to his knees. He poured every ounce of his being into every single note. But in 1960s America, there was a wall between black music and white audiences. A thick, invisible, merciless wall. Otis was selling out theaters in Harlem and Memphis and Atlanta. But the mainstream pop charts, the ones dominated by the Beatles and the Beach Boys and the Rolling Stones, remained largely closed to him. And the cruel irony was that many of those white artists openly worshipped Otis. Mick Jagger called him the greatest vocalist alive. The Rolling Stones covered his songs. But the system that decided who got played on pop radio and who did not was still deeply, stubbornly segregated. Otis needed a breakthrough. He needed one moment that would shatter the wall forever. That moment came on June 18, 1967 at the Monterey International Pop Festival in California. The lineup was a who's who of 1960s rock royalty. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who, Jefferson Airplane, the Mamas, and the Papas. And then there was Otis Redding, the only soul act on the entire bill, booked to perform in front of an audience that was almost entirely white, almost entirely unfamiliar with his music, and almost entirely unprepared for what they were about to witness. Backstage, Otis was nervous, not the usual pre-show jitters. This was something deeper. He knew what this moment meant. He told his road manager, "If I don't get these people tonight, I might never get another chance." The crowd that afternoon had been watching rock bands all day. They had been standing, swaying, smoking, enjoying the California sun. When the announcer introduced Otis, there was polite applause, scattered and uncertain. Most of the 50,000 people in that field had no idea who he was. Otis walked to the microphone. He was wearing a green suit. His band, Booker T, and the MGs hit the first note, and then something happened that the people who were there still struggled to put into words. The sound that came from his throat was not just music. It was a force of nature. It was thunder and honey and heartbreak and joy all compressed into one unstoppable wave of pure human emotion. He sang Shake. He sang Respect. He sang, "I've been loving you too long." And somewhere during that song, something shifted in the crowd. People who had been sitting down stood up. People who had been whispering went silent. People who had come to see Jimi Hendrix found themselves unable to look away from this man in the green suit who was singing like his soul was literally on fire. By the time Otis finished his set with "Try a Little Tenderness," the entire field was on its feet. 50,000 people, almost all of them white, screaming and crying and losing their minds for a black soul singer from the cotton fields of Georgia. The wall had cracked. For those 30 minutes at Monterey, it did not exist at all. But at the exact moment Otis was on the verge of becoming the biggest crossover artist in history, his voice was failing. Months of screaming into microphones had formed polyps on his vocal cords. The doctor told him he needed surgery and had to change the way he sang. During his recovery, lying in bed unable to speak, something remarkable happened. He started listening to Bob Dylan and the Beatles, and he started wondering what it would sound like if he stopped screaming and started whispering. In August of 1967, Otis was in San Francisco for a concert at the Fillmore. Concert promoter Bill Graham offered him a quiet place to stay, a houseboat in Sausalito. For 3 or 4 days, Otis did something he had almost never done. He sat still. He watched the San Francisco Bay. He watched the ships coming in and going out. He listened to the water lapping against the hull. And he started strumming a guitar, singing 2 lines over and over. His road manager, Speedo Sims, watched him for days. I didn't understand where he was going with it. It sounded different from anything he had ever done. He was changing. Otis wrote those lines on scraps of paper, then kept writing for months on napkins, on hotel stationery, slowly building something he had never built before. Not a soul screamer. Something quiet. Something that sounded like a man sitting at the edge of the world, watching time pass. On December 7, 1967, Otis walked into Stax Studios to finish the song with Steve Cropper. He did not check into a hotel first, which is what he always did. He called Cropper from the airport and said, "I'm on my way right now. You've got to hear this." 15 minutes later, he burst through the studio door. In 30 minutes, they finished the song. Cropper wrote most of the remaining lyrics, but he wrote them about Otis. About Otis's real life. "I left my home in Georgia, headed for the Frisco Bay." That was Otis's actual story. The boy from the cotton fields who traveled all the way to California and sat on a dock wondering what it all meant. They recorded it that night with Booker T, Jones on keyboards, and Al Jackson Jr. on drums. Otis conducted every part, singing horn lines to the Memphis horns and beating out the rhythm with his hands. When they played it back, the control room went quiet. Cropper knew immediately. "We knew we finally had the song that would cross him over." Not everyone agreed. Jim Stewart, the president of Stax, was worried. Bassist Duck Dunn thought it might be detrimental to Otis's career. But Otis looked at everyone in that room and said, "This is my first #1 hit." At the very end, Otis was supposed to do an ad-lib outro, but he forgot what he was going to say. So instead, he just whistled. He whistled the melody softly, casually, like a man sitting on a dock with nothing to do and nowhere to be. A beautiful, perfect, heartbreaking accident. That whistle would become one of the most recognizable moments in recorded music. But Otis would never hear the finished version. He would never hear the seagulls and crashing waves that Cropper added to the mix after his death. Because 3 days after recording that whistle, Otis Redding was dead. December 8th, Otis and his band, the Bar-Kays, flew from Memphis to Nashville in his twin-engine Beechcraft. The Bar-Kays were teenagers. Most of them were still in high school. Jimmy King, the guitarist, was 18. Ronnie Caldwell, the organist, was 18. Carl Cunningham, the drummer, was 18. Phelan Jones, the saxophonist, was 19. And Ben Cauley, the trumpet player, was 20. They were kids playing with the biggest soul star in the world, getting picked up from school on Fridays, flying to gigs on weekends. Some of them needed permission slips from their parents. That is how young they were. The first thing Ben noticed about the plane that weekend was the battery. They asked the pilot, Dick Fraser, to start the engine so they could get warm. Fraser said no. The battery was low. The boys looked at each other. Nobody said anything. They flew to Nashville, then Cleveland, where they appeared on a television show and played at a club called Leo's Casino. It was a good night. Nobody knew it was the last concert Otis Redding would ever perform. December 10th. The plan was to fly from Cleveland to Madison, Wisconsin for a gig at a dance club called The Factory. The weather was bad. Fog and drizzle hung over the Midwest. The Bar-Kays bassist, James Alexander, was supposed to be on the plane, but there was not enough room, and he took a commercial flight instead. That decision saved his life. The Beechcraft took off with 8 people on board. Most of the passengers fell asleep. Ben Cauley drifted off while clutching his seat cushion. He did not know why he was holding it. He just was. It saved his life. At 3:28 in the afternoon, 3 miles from the runway, the plane began shaking violently. Ben woke up, unable to breathe. He looked at Phelan Jones, who was staring out the window. Phelan said, "Oh no." The plane spiraled nose first into the partially frozen surface of Lake Monona. The impact tore a wing off and ripped the fuselage open. 7 of the 8 people on board were killed instantly or drowned. Otis Redding, the pilot, the valet, for members of the Bar-Kays. All gone. Ben does not remember the impact. He remembers waking up in the water, dizzy, his head swollen, clutching that seat cushion. Because he had unbuckled his seatbelt during the chaos, he was thrown clear of the wreckage. He bobbed to the surface, freezing, barely conscious. And then he heard them, his friends, in the water around him. Some of the Bar-Kays had freed themselves from the wreckage. Carl Cunningham surfaced, gasping for air. Ronnie Caldwell came up, crying for help. Ben screamed, "Brother, hold on." But the water was barely above freezing. Ben could not swim. He had never learned. Every time he tried to reach his friends, the current pushed him further away. He watched them struggle. He heard their voices grow weaker. He saw them slip beneath the surface, one by one. And there was nothing he could do. He just floated there, holding a seat cushion, screaming their names into the fog while the lake swallowed them whole. A nearby resident heard the crash and called the authorities. A police boat arrived about 20 minutes later. Ben was pulled from the water, shivering violently, suffering from hypothermia and shock. The police inspector said a person without diving gear would not survive more than 20 minutes in that water. Ben had been in it for almost exactly that long. When they brought Otis Redding's body up from the bottom of the lake, he was still strapped to his seat. When they told Ben at the hospital that everyone else was dead, he could not process it. His mind simply refused to accept the information. 24 hours earlier, he had been on stage with these people. He could still hear Jimmy's guitar riff from the last song. He could still see Ronnie's fingers dancing across the keys. He could still feel the vibration of Carl's drums in his chest. These were not just bandmates. These were his brothers. They had grown up together on the streets of South Memphis. They had formed their first band together, calling themselves the Imperials before changing the name to the Bar-Kays. They had walked into Stax Studios together as teenagers and walked out as professional musicians. And now they were gone. All of them. Every single one. And Ben was alive, lying in a hospital bed in Madison, Wisconsin, with bandages on his face and the taste of lake water still in his throat. Reporters asked him why he survived. Ben gave the only answer he could. "I guess God was with me." But surviving was not the blessing everyone assumed. Ben Cauley spent the rest of his life haunted by that lake. He had nightmares about the crash almost every night for 48 years. Not sometimes. Not occasionally. almost every single night. He dreamed of freezing water. He dreamed of Phelan's voice saying, "Oh no." He dreamed of Ronnie calling for help and the current pulling them apart. He dreamed of the silence that came after. That terrible, absolute silence when there were no more voices calling from the water. Even decades later, Ben would start talking about that day and tears would come immediately. His face would twist with pain that time had not softened even slightly. One person who met him years later wrote, "He was still extremely haunted by the event. The pain was all over his face." But Ben Cauley did not let the nightmare destroy him. And this is where his story becomes something more than a tragedy. He picked up his trumpet and played again. He and James Alexander, the other surviving member, rebuilt the bar case. They recruited new members and rebuilt the band from the ashes as a tribute to the friends they lost. "My appearances were dedicated to the friends I lost," Ben said. He meant it with every fiber of his being. The rebuilt Bar-Kays backed Isaac Hayes on his landmark album, Hot Buttered Soul. They became one of the most successful funk bands of the 70s and 80s. And Ben became one of the most in-demand session musicians in Memphis. He played with Elvis Presley, Aretha Franklin, the Doobie Brothers, Michael Jackson, Bobby Womack. The list goes on. In 1989, Ben suffered a massive stroke and brain aneurysm. Doctors thought he would die. He did not. He survived again, just as he had survived the lake. He recovered, and then he picked up his trumpet and played again. Because that is what Ben Cauley did. He survived, and then he played. Meanwhile, the song Otis recorded 3 days before his death was released in January of 1968. It went straight to #1, the first posthumous single in history to top the Billboard Hot 100. It sold more than 4 million copies worldwide. It won 2 Grammy Awards. And that whistle, that accidental, perfect whistle, became the sound of Otis Redding's Ghost, a man singing to us from the other side. In 2007, 40 years after the crash, Ben returned to Madison, Wisconsin for the first time. There was a memorial at the Monona Terrace, built on the very shore of the lake that nearly killed him. He spoke briefly about the crash. His voice trembled, his eyes filled with tears, and then he raised his trumpet and played "Try a Little Tenderness." He played it for Otis. He played it for Jimmy and Ronnie and Carl and Phelan. He played it for every person who has ever lost someone they loved and had to find a way to keep living. Ben Cauley died on September 21, 2015 at the age of 67. James Alexander, his lifelong friend, said, "He had that happy-go-lucky personality that was contagious. He was always the guy that showed out. Just a hell of a musician, a hell of an entertainer, a brother, and a friend." Robert Gordon, the Stax Records historian, added, "Ben was a strong spirit. You could hear it in his horn. He survived the plane crash. He was not stopped by the stroke. That zest for life could be heard in the high notes he hit so casually." Otis Redding was 26 years old when he died. 5 years as a professional musician. Over 200 songs recorded. He wrote "Respect" before Aretha made it famous. He conquered Monterey before Hendrix set his guitar on fire. He recorded the first posthumous #1 hit in American history while whistling a melody he carried from a houseboat in California. And he did all of it while being told over and over that a black man from the cotton fields of Georgia could not cross over, could not reach the mainstream. He proved them all wrong. But maybe the most important thing Otis ever did was not a song. Maybe it was a decision. The decision to hire a group of teenagers from Memphis to be his band. Kids still in high school. Kids who needed permission slips. Kids like Ben Cauley, who was 18 when he first climbed aboard Otis Redding's plane and felt, for the first time, that he was part of something extraordinary. Otis heard them play and ran backstage and said, "Y'all are incredible." He flew them to gigs on his own plane. He treated them like family. And on December 10, 1967, he took most of them with him when he left this world. If this story moved you, if Ben Cauley's courage and Otis Redding's genius and the fragile, beautiful nature of life and music made you feel something real, subscribe and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that even after the worst day of your life, you can pick yourself up and keep playing. Because that is what Ben Cauley taught us. Not how to survive a plane crash, but how to survive everything that comes after. How to carry the weight of loss without letting it crush you. How to honor the dead by refusing to stop living. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to find the strength to keep going when everything told you to give up? Tell us in the comments, and ring that notification bell for more true stories about the legends who changed music forever.